Hello everyone, Amy R here with Prairie Paper and Ink, and I have a couple cards to share with y'all using several honeybee sets and dies and whatnot. So to start off with, I did my backgrounds first, and this is just Simon Says Stamps 120 pound white cardstock. And I'm just using my Waffle Flower water media mat because I'm really liking using this when I'm doing ink blending like this because it kind of suctions the cardstock in a sense. So I'm using Distress Oxide inks to do my blending and heavily applying the ink with a mini ink blending tool. And for my first card background here, I started with Spun Sugar, which was my lightest. Then I worked on Picked Raspberry, Seedless Preserves, and then Chipped Sapphire at the end. And I kind of go back and forth between the colors to get, that nice blend. Then I'm going to set this aside, wipe off the media mat, and work on another background using different colors. I could have done them both with the same colors, but I'm always curious to see how a card that's very similar looks with different colors. Plus, it's just fun to play with the Distress Oxides. So for my second background, I used Cracked Pistachio, doing the same thing. I'm working my way from the bottom, but the bottom's also where I'm putting the lightest color. So it just makes it easier to do the blend. So Cracked Pistachio, and then I'm blending that into Peacock Feathers. And then I'm going to add Mermaid Lagoon above that. And again, just kind of working back and forth with the blending tools to get just a nice blend. And then finally ending with Blueprint Sketch. And normally I would start adding, a bunch of splatter and get the water effects and all that. But this time I'm not doing any of that because I'm going to die cut both these backgrounds. So I just left that off completely. So both backgrounds I'm going to die cut with the Northern Star cover plate wafer die. And this is an A2 size. So I had already cut my cardstock down to slightly larger than A2 size. So I get a nice clean cut. There is a cover plate that's more like a falling snow background, which would work really well for these cards too. But I really love this cover plate die. I love the kind of star shapes of it all. So I die cut both backgrounds with that using my Platinum 6, and I did add a metal shim just because there's obviously a lot of little intricate areas, and this is a large wafer die. So this just made sure I only had to put it through once and it die cut perfectly. So I die cut both of my backgrounds with this cover plate die. So now my backgrounds are essentially done. I'm just going to back them with some glitter paper, and it's actually Tonic's Sugar Crystal cardstock. It's just a white glitter paper. So I cut down some glitter paper just slightly smaller than those backgrounds, but I also have a couple scraps of that glitter paper because I want to create kind of a little snowy hill scene for the front of my cards. So I'm going to trim this piece in half so I can run it through a couple times using the Hill Borders Honey Cut size. So I'm mostly just kind of eyeballing it at this point. At a rough idea, I didn't want the snow banks or whatever to be too large. I don't want them covering up too much of my card. So I just kind of eyeballed how I wanted to go. I knew I wanted to layer two pieces. So once I was kind of happy with how I had those positioned, same thing. I'm going to run this through my die cut machine. This time I don't need the metal shim at all. It just the two cutting plates in the base and it's good to go. And I'm going to do this twice so that I've got the die cuts for both cards. So I'm going to set these aside. I just decided to do this while I had my die cut machine, in front of the camera, etc. So after I've got my little snowbanks die cut, I save the remaining pieces of the glitter paper just in the package because you never know. I could die cut snowflakes from that later on, whatever I want to do. I always save every little scrap when it comes to glitter paper because you can always die cut them for, other random things or cut little strips, etc. So set those aside, and then for my main images, I'm using the Snow Buddies stamp set from Honeybee. And I have a piece of Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80 pound cardstock. This is my go-to cardstock when I am planning to do any sort of Copic coloring or just alcohol markers in general. So I'm going to line up a whole bunch of the stamps from this set. This is a 6x8 set. So I chose, a couple of the snowmen and then a ton of the accessories, etc. Lined them all up on my cardstock here inside of my Misty. And then I'm going to stamp these images with Ink on 3's Blackout ink. I'm going to have to ink these up more than once since I'm stamping a whole bunch of them. Plus I just want to get a good, crisp black impression. So with my Misty, that's the one thing I really like about this time of year is I'm almost always wearing like a cardigan or long sleeves. So the easiest way to get a nice smooth impression with stamps is to just pull it over the palm of my hand and rub that on the lid of the Misty. And then I get like an almost perfect impression. So I inked up the stamps, stamped them a second time to get a good impression. And then I just used an acrylic block to stamp the little charcoal dots on each of the snowmen. And then after I'd done that, I removed all the stamps and lined up the little branches for their arms. These I didn't want to stamp in black. I thought it would, make more sense to stamp these with brown. So I lined them up in that top portion there, the cardstock, and I'm just going to ink these up with Simon's dark chocolate ink. So ink those up. I'm going to stamp those a couple times to get a good impression. And then after I've got all my stamping done, I can get on to coloring everything in with my Copic markers. So I kept the snowmen themselves very, very simple. Just added a little bit of very, very pale, the blue-green colors just to give them that little bit of definition. But again, kept it very simple and did the same thing with this little, his cap, or as we Canadians like to call it, a toque. Added just little bits of that, blended it out with a lighter color. And then everything else, all my colors were inspired by the backgrounds I had done with like the Distress Oxide inks. So I wanted to color everything in colors that are going to coordinate nicely with those inks, which is obviously like blues, purples, pinks, etc. So after I did my snowmen, did their little carrot noses with my go-to color combo for just a nice orange, which is YR09, YR07, YR04. And then the bunnies I did with just a little bit of light gray, because bunnies this time of year, when it's winter time, they turn white. We have a ton of bunnies around here. Literally, there's like bunny trails when I'm walking my kids to school. They end up in our backyard. They're really hard to see this time of year when there is enough snow on the ground because they turn completely white. So I added just a little bit of gray for that tiny bit of just, give them a bit of shading and definition. And then I got into all the accessories. So I'm going to do, some purples to bring in the purple I did in the one background. And all of the Copics I used, I've tried very hard. Trying to get in a habit of putting the lid like up so everyone can see what color I'm using and the color combos I'm using on the screen. Because otherwise I just tend to forget. But for the purples, I did V09, V06, and V04. And then I'm going to do some blues, which were B05, B04, and B02, just working darkest to lightest. I've said this in other videos I've done when it comes to Copic markers. If you're newer to coloring with Copics, or if you haven't had a lot of practice with them, or you just struggle with it, it works. It's a lot more, you have a lot more control if you go lightest to darkest. I go darkest to lightest because I've been, using these for close to 15 years now, something like that. And for me, it's a speed thing. I can color a lot faster if I go darkest to lightest. However, you don't have as much control. It is a lot difficult, sometimes impossible, to lighten up colors. Like you can a little bit with Copic markers by, adding a lighter color or adding the colorless blender, but it is still much more difficult. So if you struggle with it, I definitely recommend just working lightest to darkest, because then you do have a lot more control about where you're placing your colors and the blends and whatnot. So after I was done all my coloring, I pulled out my favorite white gel pen. This is the Jelly Roll 10 white gel pen. So just the widest white gel pen that I've got. And just adding little like highlights and whatnot to all of these images. Somewhat following the way I had colored them with shading and whatnot, but at the same time, I don't really follow the rules when it comes to light sources and all that. I just add it wherever I think it'll just look nice, and it just gives it that little extra bit of, texture and definition. So after I've done all my coloring and all my highlighting, I am going to use the coordinating wafer dies. I'm going to tape these into place with washi tape. I had purposely spaced out all of these images on the cardstock, but when I was stamping them, so that I would have enough space to be able to just line up all of these dies so I can die cut these all in one pass through my die cut machine. So I ran them through my Platinum 6, so now they're all die cut and ready to go. So then it's just a matter of stamping my sentiments and whatnot and getting those ready to go, and then I can assemble my cards. So for my sentiments, I'm using the winter stamp set, this little tiny stamp set. And I've just taken a couple of the smaller sentiments from it. And I have my black cardstock that I used my anti-static powder tool on. And then I am inking up these sentiments with Ink on 3's juicy clear embossing ink. And I'm lining them up. I had already lined them up on my acrylic blocks. They're straight. And then I'm lining them up just along this bottom edge of this cardstock. I'm trying to keep everything as even as possible, just because it's going to make it easier when I trim down these sentiments in a minute. And all the sentiments I stamped twice because I'm going to make 2 cards. So after I'd stamped them, I'm coating them with detail white embossing powder, melt that embossing powder with my heat tool. And since I stamped them, you know, all in a straight line, I can now easily just trim these down with my paper trimmer. If I had wanted to, I could have just stamped them, you know, at random and then die cut them with like the honeybee has like sentiment strips, etc. But this just was quick and easy. So this way I can just run this through with my little Tim Holtz guillotine paper trimmer and quickly trim these down. And then I've got most of the sentiments for the front of the card. I obviously want to die cut the winter word. There is the large stamp in this set that you could just stamp or stamp and heat emboss if you want. But I have the dies and I wanted to die cut the word from that same glitter cardstock. So I die cut it from glitter cardstock and I also die cut it from white cardstock. And normally I would do, you know, 2, maybe even 3 layers of just the regular cardstock and then add the glitter die cut on top just to give it, you know, a lot of definition. But this time I only did the 2 layers and I was happy with that. It just gave it that little extra bit of depth. It's funny how something as simple as that is just kind of popping things up, you know, with a bit of dimension or adding an extra layer of cardstock really gives a card a more finished look. So I adhered those 2 layers together with just some craft tacky glue. And then for the dot on the eye, I left the white cardstock in what will be the scrap of cardstock. Just made it easier to kind of line up the glitter one on top, just using my little reverse tweezers, and then pop that out before the glue has a chance to dry in case the glue oozes out around the edges and then ends up gluing itself in the cardstock. That has happened. So after I was done on my die cutting, now I can just start assembling. So I'm going to use the craft tacky glue to adhere my ink blended backgrounds to the glitter paper. If I'm adhering on top of glitter paper, I like to use something like a liquid adhesive, or if I have to, I'll use, you know, maybe some score tape, like something really, really strong. But I find the best bet if you're going to adhere anything to glitter cardstock is to use a good, strong liquid adhesive because it just kind of helps kind of seep into it and really hold something down. Whereas something like a tape runner and, you know, those sorts of things don't really adhere to a glitter because, again, it's just glitter, you know? So adhered those to the glitter background so that, you know, peeks through those die cuts. So you've got all that shimmer and sparkle. And then I did the same thing with my little snowbanks. I adhered one and then the top layer I popped up with just a little bit of foam tape. And then I adhered the characters. I had already off camera figured out like which character I want for which card, the little accessories, you know, there's the gifts and the gift bags and the bunnies, of course. So I kind of figured out what I wanted to do for each card, and then it was just a matter of adhering everything into place. So once I was kind of happy with that, I just adhered them down with the craft tacky glue, and then I'm doing the exact same thing with the sentiment. And that winter sentiment does have outlines as well. Like it has the word, has the outline, has the second outline. I didn't want to use any of the outlines for this because I didn't want to cover any more of the background than I needed to. Like I wanted that all that ink blending and the die cut and the glitter cardstock to actually show on this card. So after I adhered the sentiments, I finished adhering, you know, the little characters and whatnot. So card number 1 is done. I followed the exact same process for the second card, just using the different characters and the little snowbanks and whatnot, and created a slightly different scene. So I adhered everything again with the craft tacky glue. I popped up that little snowbank on the front with a bit of foam tape just to give it that little extra bit of dimension. And I set those aside so I can stamp the insides of my cards. So I have my card bases here, and then I have the Season to Sparkle stamp set. And I am lining up one of the sentiments in my Misty again, and I'm going to stamp this with VersaFine Clair Onyx Black ink. I could have inked this up with Ink on 3 Blackout, but it's such a habit for me when it comes to sentiments like this that I want to stamp in black to reach for the VersaFine Clair. It just gives such an even, like, perfect coverage. So I'm going to stamp both of the card bases, or like the insides of the cards, with this sentiment stamp. And then I pulled off there's a bunch of snowflakes in this set. So I pulled a bunch off and put them on acrylic blocks, and then I'm going to stamp the insides of each card with those snowflakes using the same Distress Oxide combos I used on the front of each card. So for this one, I'm using the pinks with the purples. So again, the spun sugar, picked raspberry, seedless preserves, and chipped sapphire. Just kind of stamping the snowflakes around the sentiment on the inside of the card, just kind of tie it all together. And then after I did card base number 1, I'm going to wipe off those stamps, and I'm going to just repeat the process with the inside of the second card using the other color combo I had used, which was the cracked pistachio, peacock feathers, mermaid lagoon, blueprint sketch. So I just kind of inked up each snowflake and just kind of randomly stamped them around the sentiment. It just kind of tied it all together, in my opinion. So after I'd finished stamping all of those snowflakes, all I have to do is adhere the card fronts to the card bases. And I'm just going to do that with some craft tacky glue. And like I'd mentioned, that Northern Star cover plate is A2 size, so 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. So both of those card fronts are going to completely cover these card bases because they're just top folding A2 cards. So I'm just going to squeeze a bit of that craft tacky glue on the back of it, position it into place, making sure I've got it adhered straight and none of the actual card base is peeking out or, crooked or anything like that. I'm going to do that with both of these cards, and then that's going to finish off both cards. I decided not to add any embellishments, which for me is not usually the norm. Usually I'm adding, a ton of bling, everything else, but I used all that glitter cardstock, so it just gave all that, shimmer and glitter and then the inked background, etc., that I felt there was no need to add any other embellishments with this. Like, the scenes were complete. So once these are both done, that's it. So I'll show these, kind of hold them up to the light so you guys kind of get an idea of just the glitter and shimmer. It's so pretty. So I will have links to everything I used in the description box below the video, so you can check that out if you are interested. Thank you all so much for watching and for your comments and support. I really, really appreciate it. And a huge thank you to the Crafters Collective for inviting me to guest this month. This is really fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and hopefully I will see you all over on my channel, which will also be linked below, and in my blog, etc. And thank you guys so much for watching. Bye!